Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I'm chief economist at American Compass. And this week we are traveling across the pond, at least virtually, to speak with Nick Timothy, a member of parliament in the UK. Nick represents West Suffolk and has been active in the Tory party for a long time. He was actually chief of staff for a time for Prime Minister Theresa May and is one of the real leaders trying to reshape conservatism in the United Kingdom in much the same way we are working on it here at American Compass. So it's a really interesting conversation about his own political background, about his experience running for office, and about the many challenges the Conservative Party is facing in the UK, both similar to and different from what the Republican Party is going through here in the US. So I certainly learned a lot. Hope you will as well. Before we get to that, have to tell you about everything else going on at American Compass this week. On the Commons, have a really interesting piece from Brian Burek of the Heritage Foundation on the US-China relationship and what he calls the need to bring back Trump's China policy. Today we had a fun piece from Duncan Braid, coalition director here at American Compass, on Potemkin presidential politics. And then the Compass Point this week is from EPPC's Brad Littlejohn on the way that modern technology is eliminating all of the restraints that are necessary, at least in conservatism's point of view, to human flourishing. And that is, I think, therefore I am. So please take a look at those. If you are not already, please subscribe to my Substack, Understanding America. We never rest. We were out on Labor Day with a good summary of my past work and current thinking on labor policy and the reforms we need. And then, of course, we'll be back Friday with another link roundup, as we do every Friday. So go read all of that. But first, enjoy this conversation with MP Nick Timothy. And we are joined by MP Nick Timothy. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
We've been in touch for a while now as we sort of pursue somewhat similar projects on our respective sides of the Atlantic with respect to conservatism. You actually had the guts to run for office and win, so
I was
congratulations.
I was one of a relatively small number of Conservatives who did win in this election, sadly. But yes, I did. I did make it.
But well, there's a lesson in that I want to get to. But let's start by introducing listeners to a bit more, maybe going back to the middle of the last decade, Brexit and on. What have you been up to?
So I spent the first 5 years of the last decade working as a senior advisor in the Home Office, which kind of covers bits of the DOJ and Homeland Security and that kind of thing in American parlance. And found myself chief of staff at number 10 for about a year after the Brexit referendum and before 2017 election, which didn't go so well for the Conservatives, not as badly as the one we've just had, but not so well for the Conservatives. And I've been writing and trying to think and go and meet various thinkers and academics and politicians to try to work out an agenda that reflects the kind of realignment that I think you identified in the States and that we identified in the UK, and that work is not complete. There's a lot more that the party needs to do.
Yeah, well, likewise here. But it is there are so many interesting points of similarity and divergence maybe between what is happening to conservatives and their manifestation in the Republican Party and with the Tories. I think people see the Trump election and Brexit in a sense as kind of parallel starting guns. Um, how would you describe sort of what the trajectory has looked like since Brexit in the UK? At what point did people sort of wake up to the recognition that something needed to change? Where was the resistance to that change? And sort of what has that meant for the interplay of ideas on the right of center in the years since?
Yeah, I mean, the comparison with the Trump election, holds in some ways, but maybe not in as many as some
Hmm.
commentators have suggested. I mean, Britain's membership of the European Union or the European Community as it was before was always controversial. It was controversial when we first contemplated going in. Finally went in 73. There was an almost immediate referendum in 75 uh, because it had been controversial that we'd entered. Every step of integration through that period, all the way until departure, was incredibly controversial. So it was quite a, a long run process. I suppose some of the similarities lie in what the Brexit vote revealed about voter allegiance and what was driving people's political choices. I think it showed that the two political parties had underplayed um, issues of culture and identity, which obviously rising in salience across the West. It, I think, more deeply revealed a kind of political class that couldn't see past the kind of liberal consensus that it had, liberal both in economic policy terms and in social and cultural issues. Um, and it exposed quite big social and geographical divides in the country. Some people after the Brexit referendum, I think, tried to say that Brexit was the cause of these divides. Brexit itself had divided the country, and to some extent, it did accelerate that sense of division. But actually, I think what it really did was expose something that had existed for quite a long time. And I remember there was a letter to the Financial Times not long after Brexit, when the establishment was still in shock and people were talking about how to oppose it, overturn it, change it, soften it, and so on. And this letter in the Financial Times said, "This is the first time our side of the argument has ever lost. This is why so many people are angry, and we need to actually accept that we have lost." And I think there was an element of truth in that, because it was it was a singular moment of disruption for an establishment that, sure, there were differences of emphasis and things like that, but actually shared beliefs um, to a surprising degree, surprising to some people, I would think, across party divides.
And so, to what extent, if at all, have the parties in fact adapted, and in what directions? I mean, I think one big challenge we see in the U.S. generally is that you still have a quite bipartisan elite that just thinks this is all ridiculous and would like to go back to how things were before. To the extent that there is openness to departing from it, it has come mostly on the right within the Republican Party, whereas the left has almost sort of sought to become more progressive and bubbled in a set of priorities that seem misaligned with an awful lot of the country. But certainly on the right, there is still a tooth and nail fight between those who either just directly support Trump or see Trump as an inflection point to something new versus those who would just like to go back to 2014. What is the dynamic on your side of the pond?
Yeah, there's similar things at play. I mean, I think some people would just like to go back to the world as it was. I don't think that that's actually in any way realistic. Not just because of Brexit, but because there is a reason why there is this realignment going on across lots of Western countries. I think it's quite deep rooted. Some of it's about the economic and social reality of life in places that have really lost out because of the reality of globalization as we've had it. Lots of these places are kind of post-industrial towns and cities that haven't found something new, where historically they might have always voted left, and people have started to say, well, what's the point of voting left? We don't seem to get very much out of it. But it's also about intellectual trends, isn't it? Some of which I'll blame it all on you and your listeners. That's coming out of that's mainly coming out of American academia, and what it means to be left wing these days is less about things like class solidarity, and supported by things that lots of people used to take as axiomatic, the sort of patriotism, shared identity, social norms that help to bring about some kind of cohesion, and much more about radical diversity and strange critical theories. But that's probably a rabbit hole we don't want to go down. Um, and that's those are the things that have driven this. And then what happened immediately after Brexit was the parties did sort of scratch their heads a bit and say, "Well, how did this happen? Why aren't they listening to us? We told them it would be bad." Um, and on the left, it tended to be people saying, um, of course, they weren't really voting, on Brexit itself. It's very complicated. People don't really understand the technicalities of these things. It was really a sort of a cry of anguish, and that kind of thing. And but at least to some degree, they were actually engaging with. I would say incorrectly, but they were engaging with what had just happened. And I
Hmm.
think now everyone's kind of gone past that, and and even if it's for the people who would actually quietly like it, or not so quietly in some cases, to go back in, um, but even for the rest of us who voted for it and actually think that it's uh, you know an exemplar of what it is we're talking about, with a crisis of democracy and popular sovereignty and identity and economic models, um, nobody's really very much up for talking about it. And I think that's kind of where we are at the moment. And so even the Conservative Party, which for a while looked like the big beneficiary of the realignment, has found that realignment quite difficult, because there's a lot of people at the top of the Conservative Party, influential people, who see that there are significant numbers of formerly Labour voting people who might be up for voting Conservative, and which I think is wonderful. It's a big opportunity to become a genuinely national party, sort of across all the regions and counties of the country, but also a proper cross-class party. And they said, "Well, I'm a bit nervous about this because this would change what we are. Some of these people want some of our money. They're demanding higher public spending, and that will mean higher taxes, and we don't want that, do we?" And obviously, at the opposite end of the realignment, where uh, you know it, the trend has been towards voting for more left-wing parties in university towns and cities, you also have Conservatives saying we're losing our people, the kind of people they identify with,
Hmm.
uh, because frankly, whether they think of themselves as elites or elitist, that's the kind of mentality that they might have.
Yeah, and
Well, it's
so
very, very difficult for the
yeah,
party.
it's interesting. Because I exactly what I wanted to ask is, what is this meant in tangible terms? Are there places where policy has really shifted, where the conservative, you can say, look, conservatives used to stand for X, now they stand for Y, in sort of both in response to the shift in who the base of the party is, and in pursuit of solidifying that, or is it all, a little bit to your point, sort of still not talked about all that
It's
much?
Well, it's a lot messier than that. So the Boris Johnson approach to all of this, and I think in electoral terms, Boris and his team really understood this very well, which is why the Conservatives won such a big majority in the 2019 election. In 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 policy terms, his response was, uh, "Great, well, let's just spend. We'll spend on infrastructure. We'll create funds for towns that need a bit of investment and renewal, and that kind of thing." And that agenda, which I don't think was terribly sophisticated, but that agenda then ran into the reality of COVID and the energy crunch, which has been incredibly expensive in this country, was a big state intervention when energy prices spiked very severely. And look, we've suffered much more in that respect than I think you have in the US
Yep.
for obvious reasons of supply. And that agenda kind of ran aground. My personal view is, and this is why I think it's really important that we make sure that there is a properly integrated understanding and policy approach across questions of culture and economics and the geography and place is really important in that. Is that my view is, what Boris called leveling up can't really succeed with the economic model we have. It's not as simple as saying, well, we'll we'll just carry on relying on London and the southeast of England and financial and business services, and we'll just redistribute the proceeds around the country and hope that something better will come up. It's actually about questions that lots of politicians find slightly baffling. Um, you know, when I talk about changing the economic model of the country, I'm saying we need to be looking at proper reindustrialization. And a lot of, especially conservative politicians who are schooled on, the politics and economics of Margaret Thatcher and non-interventionism, think that this is some kind of anathema. Now, I don't agree, and I think it's somewhere we need to head towards, and that's somewhere our circumstances are different to in America, but we can learn from some of the things that are taking place in the States. But we need to understand how fast the world is changing, and the model of globalization that we all grew up with, I think, has gone. Um, but lots of people here still think in terms of some free and fair international trading system, where I don't think it ever has been free or fair anyway, but it certainly isn't now.
Yeah.
And that takes you into policy places that lots of people find quite difficult,
Yeah.
about the role of the state in trying to restore the conditions where you can have proper market-led growth in some particular places, but also about what it takes to revitalize industry and reshore. And some of those things people find a bit easier, whether that's about infrastructure and skills and planning reform and things like that. But there are also things that people definitely don't find easy, which is about trade and subsidies and tariffs uh, and whether it's even feasible for a
Right.
country the size of Britain to do those things.
Yeah, I think in this respect, it's a almost precise parallel to the debate that's going on within the conservative movement in the United States on these economic questions. It has seemed to me, though, that the difference is that uh, regardless of who's gotten farther in the intellectual debates, that the political leaders in the U.S., particularly because of Trump's presence, and now you see someone like J.D. Vance on the ticket with him, are at least to some extent committing in that direction. Whereas I look at what's happened in the UK with Prime Minister Truss, Sunak, it almost feels more like what many people in the Republican Party in the US wanted to do, which was, well, let's just put Nikki Haley back up there, or, can't why can't we get Paul Ryan to run for the nomination and so forth. Is that fair that the leaders who have ended up representing, at the top of the so-called ticket in the UK have represented much more the pre-Brexit, pre-realignment model of conservative policy?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think so. Boris was the kind of shock to the
Yeah,
system, and the party it turned to him only really reluctantly. I mean, not necessarily for reasons of ideology, but um, you know, there was never very much trust in him as a person and his ethics and that kind of thing. So the party turned to him when 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 it found itself in a terrible hole because Brexit hadn't been delivered and there was kind of parliamentary gridlock and so on. Um, and and then when he self-immolated, because that is that is what happened. It wasn't really a policy failure as such. It was more about those questions of trust returning. The party went back to, I think, what it thought it knew, and and Liz offered a kind of reassuring sort of. I don't think it was. I didn't think it was as well thought through as the original product, but a sense of a kind of reassuring neo-Thatcherism. And then when that went wrong, Rishi was, I don't know, I think that he felt like an echo of the kind of Cameron government, more technocratic, more focused on fiscal rectitude, and that kind of thing. And I wonder if one of the differences might be the differences in our systems. Or we're obviously a parliamentary system. Our leaders, whether they're party leaders or the members of the cabinet or the shadow cabinet or whatever, have to come from within that parliamentary system. And so maybe for us, the kind of intellectual changes we're talking about becoming policy changes and political changes, maybe that takes time
Yeah.
as new cohorts enter parliament.
Well, it's a good point that one point that always has to be made is that Donald Trump is sort of a one of one, either there is a Trump or is there not a Trump. But it's also, I guess, you can see in the U.S. system within the Republican Party, one of the disconnects we've had is that even as you have a Trump on the presidential ticket, the leaders in Congress who the party is actually elevating, Mitch McConnell in the Senate, particularly when it was Kevin McCarthy in the House. Paul Ryan was the speaker in the first 2 years of the Donald Trump administration. Those folks, in a sense, look a lot more like who in the parliamentary system
Yeah.
the Conservative Party is elevating in the UK. So fast forward then to the most recent election, which obviously did not go well, generally speaking. What is either the conventional wisdom and or your diagnosis of what has happened? How has the party, despite what could be some very positive realignment related trends, found itself where it is?
Well, I mean, I think the honest truth is that the election results can sound very complicated in that smaller parties did quite well. The Labour Party won because of our electoral system, won approaching 2/3 of the seats in Parliament, but with a little bit more than a third of the popular vote. There's lots of details like that that can complicate your understanding of the result. But actually, there was a simple truth to the result, which was it was an overwhelming rejection of the Conservative Party. There were defectors to Labour. There were defectors in seats where Labour were less strong to the Liberal Democrats. So the vote against us was very efficient. There was tactical voting to make sure we were gone in those places. There was a huge vote for Reform, which is the new party on the right, led by Nigel Farage, who'd previously led UKIP and the Brexit Party, which won 5 constituencies, but also ate into the Conservative vote share hugely in lots of other places and let Labour win in those seats. And there was an awful number of Conservatives who just didn't vote. People just didn't vote for anybody. And as a candidate, I was selected. I was selected in West Suffolk in my constituency a bit more than a year ago, and West Suffolk has always been Conservative. And I think some of the people I knew in Westminster thought I was mad for how hard I was working there, because it's the kind of place where you don't have to, surely, according to. And I mean, I don't really believe in safe seats anywhere, and if you take them for granted, you find out they're not safe quite quickly. But it always felt to me like it was going to be a difficult election. It turned out to be a far more difficult election even than I'd anticipated. And at its simplest, you have to say that is the result of the total failure of the Conservative Party. And we had, a friend of mine said, we managed to convince everybody who was right wing, that we were just sort of fluffy technocrats who didn't want to take the difficult decisions to do things. We convinced everybody who was moderate that we were sort of horrifically right wing and unlike anything that had ever existed before. Um, we were basically showing the right wingers that we couldn't do stuff, and we were telling the moderates that we were really nasty. And immigration was probably the single most
Mm.
obvious subject where that was true. We've got a huge illegal migration problem with people in small boats crossing the channel, where the party's solution was to strike an agreement with Rwanda to allow us to deport those people to have their asylum claims heard in Rwanda, or to just go back to their own countries. And that was never operationalized, mainly because it wasn't consistent with the jurisprudence of the European Convention on Human Rights. So, so lots of people sort of could see that the party was saying these things, and they were making quite big promises about these things, but they weren't willing to confront the very difficult legal choices that would have made that work or not work. But that was really only a visible symbol of a bigger problem with immigration, which is Brexit was in part about immigration, because inside the European Union we had free movement rules. You couldn't control immigration from other European countries. Um, and immigration had gone up enormously, partly because of the expansion of the EU eastward. Um, the country then voted for Brexit, with everybody who was campaigning for Brexit saying this will give us the chance to control immigration. And the party's response to that was to design the most liberal immigration system in the world. And European immigration fell, and non-European immigration went through the roof, to the point that, for a country of our size, uh, annual net migration reached 750,000. So I mean, it's absolutely
That's
insane.
right. Well, so by comparison, the US population is probably 5, almost 6 times as large, be the equivalent of 3, 4 million, whereas we have at least legal immigration, green cards are roughly 1 million. So you're talking about a rate 3, 4 times higher, though
Yeah,
certainly if you count all the illegal immigration in the US, but a massive number.
massive number. And then there are other issues too. I mean, the general sense was that the country wasn't really working. And actually, immigration is part of that. It affects the capital stock of the country, but it's also just that the economy hasn't really grown at a healthy rate for a really long time. Which, some will say that's about austerity. I would say actually the problem started earlier. I mean, if you look at the charts, it's kind of financial crash onwards, really. Um, and some of this stuff is quite deep rooted about the kind of monetary policy we've pursued, and what that's done in different ways. But my answer is that the economic model is bust, and actually that these sort of signs of failure are only going to get bigger and more visible over time. And at each year we wait, it's going to get harder and more painful uh, to deliver the fix.
And so your point about sort of losing on both sides in a sense is it's interesting in both how it does apply in the US. Of course, the US in its very rigid two-party system, folks at least think they don't have to worry so much about that kind of pressure from both sides. But there are all sorts of ways they do, including just people not showing up to vote. And
Mm.
so it's sort of, if I think of the right metaphor, it's as if the party is kind of trying to thread the needle and instead missing to both sides at once. Um, what what did you learn from your experience campaigning, and what sort of reinforced your beliefs, or what surprised you, or forced you to kind of think harder about what it would actually take for the Conservative Party to be successful nationwide?
Well, I mean, frankly, I survived on the basis of the strength of our local campaign, which did not really emphasize much of what the party was doing nationally, and emphasized, my local credentials, the thing I was doing on local issues. The the positions I took personally on national issues, including the economy and funding public services and immigration. So I probably ran as independent a campaign as
Hmm.
you can when you're a conservative candidate. Now that's obviously not really a tenable thing for everybody to do many times, um, and uh, we undoubtedly have to deal with the drift of people to reform. Reform is potentially a very damaging thing to the Tory party. Um, but you know that politics is never as simple as saying, "Well, if we just cover off this threat on the right, then their votes plus our votes equals whatever,"
Right.
or we can cover that off on the right and then we move to the center or the left or whatever. I think this way of thinking, I'm not sure it was ever really right, but it reflects a mentality that developed in this country over the Blair and Cameron years, where I just thought of politics as just you um, just being on a single axis, and so left, right, center, bang, done. Um, when when actually, when politicians talk about the center ground, they mean what they think, what they believe. Normally, economic and social liberalism, and the real,
Hmm.
you know, the real kind of common ground that's popular with the mainstream is actually the opposite. It's a bit more interventionist and higher spending on the economy. It's more conservative on issues of identity and culture. Um, and and we obviously have to stay true to our conservative principles, but we have to try to understand what our solution is to these problems and present a really coherent picture that allows people who are tempted by alternative parties on the right and alternative parties on the center and the left to come to us. And I don't think that's impossible. I think there is a really coherent analysis of the challenges facing most Western countries, but in my case, Britain, and a coherent set of policy responses that you can develop in response to that. And in reality, lots of voters actually are more heterodox than we give them credit for anyway, because they're generally quite sort of smart, switched on people.
It's we at American Compass we always talk about this as the idea of sort of a durable governing majority, that there has to be a set of ideas that is going to actually bring together a coalition that is not going to agree on everything, but agrees on a set of important things that it can actually then get done. And I think exactly as you said, the clear identity and views of that group would be uh, essentially exactly the opposite of of what all the political leaders otherwise are instinctively talking about and focusing on. As someone obviously working in the political system, but not a active participant myself, it's very easy for me to point and say like, well, we'll just do that. Like this is this is obviously the thing that would be more popular, achieve the goals that most politicians have, and by the way, be address a lot of actual problems. um Politicians, I think, probably rightly say, well, it's actually a lot harder than that. um how would you describe those challenges as you think about, we're having a strategy meeting within the Conservative Party here, here's what the polling says, here's what we all hear from our constituents, here's how badly what we're doing right now is going, here's how we should here's how we should change. What are the obstacles to that? Why?
Yeah, I was thinking when you said that, there's a story which is probably apocryphal about the Duke of Wellington. He was a great British general who defeated Napoleon, and he later became prime minister. And there's a story that at the end of his first cabinet meeting, afterwards, he said it was extraordinary. I gave them all their orders, and then they wanted to sit around talking about it. And it's why business people who come into politics sometimes struggle,
Yeah.
and military people too. It's not the parliamentary Conservative Party is not like a division of the army that you can march in this direction or that. And I also have this conversation with some friends who say, well, the party needs to move in this direction about you know its interventionism in the economy, for example. No, I'm probably one of the most interventionist conservatives there are. I mean, I'm very aware of the fact that actually there are lots of people who aren't there. And you have to do things that are obviously consistent with not just where your colleagues in the parliamentary party or your activists or the true sort of public power base of your party, where they all sit, but also what is actually possible with the intellectual and political traditions of your party. Um, so I think there's that, but I don't think that means that it's impossible to change it. It's impossible to actually embrace the opportunities and confront the challenges of the thing we're talking about. Um, there's a lot of people on my side of politics here at the moment who they're quietly reading about the 1970s a lot,
Hmm.
because I think what people understand is um, actually the world has changed. We have been found to be lacking, which is why we lost. We need to listen and change and offer a new perspectives. Um, and so great is the change in the world um, that the answers do not lie in the things that either of the main parties have been trying to do for the last 20 years. So what was the last big change? And I mean like a really profound intellectual change in our politics. And it was when Mrs. Thatcher changed and led the party in the late 70s and early 80s. She ended up prime minister until 1990. But the intellectual work for that was mostly done through the 1970s. Working with people internationally, and there was an American influence, of course. But there were think tanks, there were business leaders, there were people like properly genuine intellectuals, that philosophically credible people who played a part in building all of that
Mhm.
and caring for the for the change that she then enacted. And now that's not to say that the kind of change we need is the same as the things she did, um, but we do need that level of
Yeah.
intellectual, political, and operational thinking and planning if we're to not only win again, but to offer the country the kind of change it really, really needs. So I think that's how a lot of people are thinking at the moment, and I think they're right to think like that. And some of us may disagree about the nature of that change, but there's a certain amount of overlap, I think, in the thinking of the people who want to put in those kinds of hard yards.
Yeah. There's a lot of that study going on here too, both looking at the transition to Reagan on the conservative side, and then the Democrats in some respect went through at least as dramatic a change 10, 15 years later, leading to Bill Clinton and the New Democrats, sort of the Tony Blair counterpart. And you're right, it sort of happens roughly once a generation, and it's not just a matter of some people seeing a better way of doing things. There's all of the institutional infrastructure and also just changeover in personnel at some
Yeah.
point. People don't so much change how they think as we we have a new set of people who might think differently.
Yeah, I think that's right. I also think there's a mindset difference that I think we need to understand as well. So, I'm 44. Uh, So I was born in 1980. I had 17 years of conservatism. I had 13 years of Labour led by Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Historically, not hugely left wing. They were left wing, but they weren't hugely left wing. And 14 years of conservative governments. This feels like a much more left wing government now that we have, the most left wing of my lifetime. And they also see that the world is changing, and their response to that is, is to be quite. Some of them think in reasonably radical terms. It's not necessarily all coherent, but certainly on things like climate change and what that means for our energy mix and what that means for our ability to sustain any kind of industry and things like that. Some of what they're doing is quite radical and it's quite left wing. So a lot of the arguments in British politics over my lifetime, obviously some of them have been quite deep, but actually quite a lot of them have been arguing about the means because we agree on the ends, or it's about who has the superior technocrats or whatever. And actually, I think it's not just that we've got to go back and rethink things quite deeply. It's also that actually the level of argument has to become much more sort of first principles. And some of the things that those of us who have been trying to change the Conservative Party for a while, we've been emphasizing values like solidarity, for example. And I'm not withdrawing from that. But we've underemphasized things like the freedom as a value because we've had conservatives in government, and generally conservatives are very respectful of freedom. We've now got a pretty socialist government, and freedom is actually going to feel more important again. So it changes what even we reformers are trying to argue and emphasize.
Yeah, we're going through exactly that, right? Even just at American Compass, we are doing a lot of work right now, both public opinion and even focus group work, discovering exactly those sorts of things. And so, well, we will keep working on it over here. If we figure it out, we will be sure to let you know. If
We
you
will be
figure it
listening.
out, please do let us know. We and thank you for all you're doing and for making the time, MP Nick Timothy of West Suffolk.
Thank you very much.
And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass podcast.